Hello, this is Dan O'Brien at Kansas State University, along with my colleagues Frayne Olson and David Ripplinger from North Dakota State University. We'd like to take some time and to discuss bioenergy issues, especially as have been affected by recent negotiations in the renewable oil industry, tariff issues that have come into play here of late, in impact on the biosector, both and also North America, as well as addressing the question at the end of what is the end game of our current situation, or at least as best as we can discuss it. So, I'd like to start off first. Frame, would you like to lead out and discuss the recent negotiations that occurred between renewable and oil industry leaders at the invitation of the Trump administration?
So this is an interesting, I guess, turn of events. Typically, when we start talking about biofuels policy and policy implications, it's usually the administration that says, all right, this is what we're going to do with consultation with the EPA as well as with USDA. And it really comes from the Washington, D.C. sector back into the industry. But the current administration is looking at a little bit different tactic. They've been asking both the oil industry as well as renewable fuels industry to get together in the room and said, you guys figure it out, make some recommendations to us, and then we'll evaluate those and more than likely take those on. And so a very different approach to being able to try and come up with some middle ground, to try and come up with some industry buy-in, if you will. And I know, Dave, you've been watching this as well pretty closely and maybe can provide some more insights.
Yeah, like you mentioned, it's really interesting and something that I don't think would have been productive a decade ago. Today, those conversations can be worthwhile. And what we've actually heard from the oil and biofuel industry jointly is that they do have shared interests and have kind of identified a path going forward in terms of levels. Uh, Again, it's because we've seen this this changing overlap, where now the petroleum industry, recognizes what biofuels bring to the table. And so those shared interests can make these conversations possible. They likely had them before, but here it was with an express purpose. And again, very different from traditional policy making. But it looks like it's been effective, and we'll see exactly what comes out in terms of rules from EPA.
One thing we haven't seen is negotiations in the press. With the articles coming out from one party or the other saying, "Oh, we can't do this. Oh, it's terrible," or whatever. But so as you stated, David, both what we're seeing now are joint statements with regard to that, and issues that in the past that have really rankled those various groups have been small refinery exemptions, the different E10 versus E15, all of that. So now there's more of a general approach to all that. Any other comments on that before we move on?
Not really, but I mean, it is a really interesting development. It is a tremendous shift in how this has been done. And again, very different than, and it's not just biofuels and the RFS and identifying RVOs. It's, for all of government to have this approach, it's very unique.
How about the impact that tariffs have had, particularly in the biofuel sector, particularly with regard to China? Again, the main I guess other party that the U.S. is dealing with all across the globe, dealing with different countries, as we've seen the last several days. And this is being recorded here on Friday, April the 4th, as we speak. But again, lots happening. Frayne, any thoughts from what you've heard with regard to impacts on the biofuel sector, particularly in the soybean, soy oil, renewable diesel frame?
Yeah, so this morning, I guess the biggest news this morning is that China did come out with additional retaliatory tariffs against the United States. So they're going to add an additional 34% tariff on all U.S. products coming into China, including soybeans as well as other agricultural products. I did see a release this morning from the U.S. Soybean Export Council. So the soybean industry responding to this. Just for perspective. These are all additive or cumulative. So they have in China a base rate for all soybean imports of about 3%. So every soybean coming into the country is tariffed at about 3%. Originally, there was an additional 10% put on U.S. soybeans. That was earlier on. And now this additional 34%. So you start adding all of those up cumulatively. And there's actually one more additive, which is a 9% value added tax. So by the time, based on the U.S. Soybean Export Council calculations, the total kind of tariff equivalent would be a little over 60% tariff on U.S. soybeans, relative to about 3%, or a little over that, with the value-added tax on the Brazilian or Argentinian soybeans. And so, the reality is this will likely cut off any kind of soybean movement, in particular, into China. So far this year, China has not bought a lot of U.S. corn. When you look at the export sales numbers for this marketing year, our corn sales as well as wheat sales into the Chinese market have been very, very low. So this is really more of a soybean play. Now, fortunately, at this time of year, the U.S. is not exporting a lot of soybeans. We don't have a lot of new soybean export sales. That usually happens earlier in the year. Once the Brazilian crop comes on board, our exports tend to drop off fairly quickly. So even though there's a lot of psychological damage being done right now, as of this morning, soybean futures prices were off between 35 and 40 cents a bushel. Um, what will be the long-term damage? I think the question really remains, how long will these tariffs be in place? So short term, at least in the short and intermediate term, it looks as though from a soybean crusher or from a renewable diesel manufacturer or from an ethanol producer standpoint, the price of the inbound product, the raw product coming into their processing facilities, will likely be lower, giving them some additional flexibility, but putting a lot of the burden onto the farm manager and the value of their inventories.
Yeah,
Disruption, yeah, disruption, uh, distortions, change in flows. David, you were going to say something?
yeah. And I was just going to say we got our prospective plannings report out earlier this week too, and we already had low soybean acres to begin with. And so, how is the market, how are farmers going to respond? If these lower prices that we're seeing today, persist or get lower. I mean, again, a 40% drop given the announcement, an additional 34% tariff. To me, I'm kind of surprised by the response. It seems less than I might have expected. So, things do kind of even out a bit. But again, what was it, like 83.5, somewhere around there for soybeans? And, you lose a few
Yeah.
more acres, it gets interesting. And absolutely agree with Frayne's thoughts about the cost of corn or soybean oil, which is definitely supportive of margins for the biofuel industry. Uh, at the same time, a question that many folks have is, are we in or going to enter a recession? And then that can have a huge role or have a huge impact on gasoline use within the United States, which is tied very closely to ethanol use. And so typically, lower prices good, use going up good, and we'll see exactly how that plays out.
I recall in the first Trump administration during trade contentions with China that there was the idea that, well, gosh, we're just going to shift the flows around. China is going to go all off to Brazil and all the other countries to the U.S. So in looking at that, at least at least Frayne and David, it seemed to me that China, being the aggressive buyer that it was, that yes, they were going full bore off into Brazil in particular, and other countries were coming to the U.S., but it's still with the other countries were less aggressive, less proactive in buying forward than China. China was, and I don't recall, at least with the numbers I was dealing with, that looking at, that we had a 1-to-1 change in that, as that flow shifted to South America. Other countries were coming in, but they were in no way as aggressive in buying forward. They were more hand to mouth at need.
Yeah.
So
So the key part that people were kind of missing in that analogy, they were looking to what typically happens in the corn market or in the wheat market. So, in corn, the primary use for corn, even internationally, is for livestock feed. And so, there isn't really any necessary processing required to have a vessel of corn offloaded, put onto a truck, and be fed to animals. Okay. And in the wheat industry, global wheat is a very fluid market anyway. There's a lot of infrastructure for wheat milling. Most countries have their own wheat milling industry. But in the soybean arena, it's very different. So we export whole soybeans. Well, those whole soybeans need to be processed into oil and meal before they're usable. Oil primarily for human consumption, or now in the case of energy, but also the meal going to livestock. So you don't feed whole soybeans. So we really, as the United States, need to export to countries or regions that have this crushing capacity. And China is the largest crusher in the world by quite a ways. United States is the second largest crusher. And then you get into number three and four for crush capacity, and it's primarily Argentina and Brazil, depending upon the year. So I don't think we're going to be selling U.S. soybeans into Brazil and Argentina to be crushed. So by the time you look at what other regions or countries have this crushing capacity that we can actually export to, the list gets pretty short, number one. And then number two, they don't have the infrastructure required to be able to increase or consume a lot of additional product. European Union being one of those. And we did see more U.S. soybeans shipped into the EU during the first trade war. But it was nowhere near the volumes required to offset what we lost in the Chinese market. So this shifting around of who's buying from who makes a lot of sense in corn and wheat, but it really doesn't play out very well in the soybean market just because of that crush requirement.
Shifting gears a little bit, with regard to North America, tariffs were not announced on this go around, most recently for Mexico and Canada. And in the bioenergy market, we at least see some analysis talking about that, discussing how canola may have been an early beneficiary. And again, you're dealing with a U.S.-Canada situation. Given your geographic location right there on the border, how do you two perceive that situation's working out? And do you see the same economic factors that are beneficial of canola as opposed to other crops in bioenergy?
I'll make a couple comments and I'll hand it over to Dave. Just specifically on the canola piece. Yeah, there's a lot of the canola that flows back and forth across the border. Canada is a much larger producer and processor of canola than we are, obviously, here in the U.S. Even the two large commercial plants that we have that do commercial crush do have to buy a lot of Canadian canola just to manage their capacity. The processing capacity is large enough we can't supply it completely domestically. So the fact that there weren't additional tariffs put on the Canadian or Mexican trade, there was earlier on the 25% that was put on earlier, but there was no additional tariffs put on Wednesday. Was positive. And there's also the kind of this exemption for some of the products that are covered under the USMCA agreement. And so, agricultural products being a big portion of that. So we didn't see as much of a direct hit or direct implication for the canola trade yet. And it's not just the raw canola, it's also for the canola oil and the canola meal. So Canada does crush a lot of that. Their number one buyer of canola oil is the United States. But their number one buyer of canola meal is China. And there's been some trade tensions between Canada and China as well that have really caused some disruptions in the Canadian canola system.
David.
Yeah, just to build on that too. So we see Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola, which is very bearish for them, and so it's nice uh, to see where we're at, where we didn't see additional tariffs put on uh, imports here to the United States, because that would have really compounded things for Canadian canola. Um, there is one of the carve outs that we saw is a 10% tariff rate on energy, which is also advantageous. And of course, we're talking about bioenergy, but we also import a considerable amount of crude oil, especially from Alberta. That's still being available, having only a relatively small tariff, be less disruptive than what could have been for at least right now. It'll be interesting to see. Again, we've seen a lot of investment in crush and renewable diesel capacity in Canada, partially to meet domestic demand, but also here in the United States. keeping that trade open or having a low tariff on that in the U.S. is good news. And Frayne, as you mentioned, I know a lot of farmers right on the border, and you tell them what the price is, and they'll either go north or south, right? It's do you go to this crush plant or another one, and it's some folks hear that and they say, my goodness, why would we ever send things up there? It's like, well, if that's how the math works out, that's which way the truck drives. So
You probably have some of the most savvy currency exchange rate oriented farmers in all the US. I mean, right there in that border. So they'd have that
They,
to.
they can do conversions pretty fast.
Yeah, that's right. To close up, um, what do you all think about the end game of this? And again, as we were talking before we came on air, the most common answer, safest answer for ag economists to give is that, well, we'll see what happens. But what what can we give as a consensus thought to folks that are wondering about where this is going and some of the impacts that might come about from the current uh, current again tariff, economic contention, confrontational environment that we're seeing on the ag side, in particular on bioenergy.
Again, I'll make a couple comments, and Dave, feel free to jump in and correct anything I make a mistake on. But that really has been a big part of the conversation, especially in the terms of how long will this last? How long are the tariffs going to be here? What are the implications for the U.S. economy? What is the probability of a potential recession here in the U.S.? There's so many questions floating around right now, and one of that the key factors is, so what is the end game? What is it that we want? What behavioral change do we want? That's driving or stimulating this policy adjustment, in particular on the tariffs. And we're getting some mixed messaging coming out of the White House, not only from President Trump directly, but also from a lot of his executive staff. The secretaries or his cabinet. We've heard, obviously, to start with Canada and Mexico, it was the fentanyl and immigration issues. That was the original impetus behind those tariffs. We've had some discussions about, well, we're trying to reduce the trade deficit that we have in the United States. And as an economist, there's some hotly debated ideas on how damaging a trade deficit really is to the U.S. economy. There's people that are bringing up, the potential for additional tax revenues, as supplementing some of the budget deficit that we have in the United States. There's been a lot of discussion about trying to bring back manufacturing into the United States, in particular automobile and truck manufacturing, as being one of those ultimate goals. And then the other one that often comes up is trying to negotiate a better, in particular, bilateral trade agreements. And they're not that they're independent. It's not that these aren't mutually exclusive, because all of those can be accomplished. But the timelines and the kind of the implications, in particular for companies investing in big infrastructure changes, for example, in the automobile manufacturing or in basic manufacturing in the U.S., those are long-term investments that require a substantial lead time to be able to get the factories built and actually become operational. And so this question about how long will these tariffs be in place? Is that really going to stimulate change in behavior, not only by companies here in the United States, but also by some of our trading partners? All of these really, from my assessment, it's really a timeline issue. How long will this last? What is the ultimate goal? If it's a long-term goal, these tariffs will likely be in place for a long time period. If it's something about negotiating better short-term trade agreements, these might come and go fairly quickly. And obviously that the answer to those questions make a big, big difference in how people respond.
yeah,
David.
I think much of it depends on the attitude and perspective of the president, who's taking the leading role in this activity. And I don't know for sure exactly what he's thinking today or will be thinking next week. What might occur then in terms of additional retaliatory tariffs, conversations that take place. And again, in many cases, we could see I could see some relationships, and some of these tariffs be addressed rather quickly. depending on responses and conversations. At the same time, I do think that some of them are going to be around for at least a few years, if not longer, and causing some some changes. And again, too, there's a difference to me between trade flows, which you know you know it's typically not a good thing economically in terms of total well-being. Um, but the structural changes, we'll see exactly what occurs. The investments, the new trade relationships, and not to add too much at the end. Looking at what happened with the first uh, Trump administration relationship with China, you saw China move away from U.S. soybeans really quick, reposition themselves, being much more flexible, and now it's very easy for them to leverage their newly created or now more strengthened relationships. And given what's happened this week and kind of communicated by China's response, they're ready to at least for some amount of time, or at least are giving the impression for some amount of time they can live without U.S. soybeans or a significant reduction in U.S. soybeans.
Going to be interesting. We'll be planting soon. We are probably as places to the south. The recent corn planting survey, I think we discussed earlier, corn versus soybeans. It's going to be hard to see below 15 billion bushels this year, even with poor yields. I calculate the numbers, even 172 bushels an acre, we have basically 15 billion bushels of corn. So probably positive for ethanol in terms of low price corn. But on the pardon me, on the soybean side, if anything, what we've just seen, what we see happening right now price-wise, this isn't going to encourage any more soybean acres to be planted. But so when you unless the usage really crunches back, it looks like the ending stocks numbers that the top end is maybe 250 to 300 million bushels, and with anything other than record high yields and usage that doesn't collapse, 100 to 150 million bushels and carryouts of 5-6%. And you bring that into play as on the end of this, by the time we get to harvest, and if we do have relatively high prices, it's going to be interesting to see where the soybean crushing industry finds itself, and i.e. the renewable aspect of that in terms of the prices of inputs and their profitability. So something to watch. So, gentlemen, any other final comments for the good of the cause?
I just remind everybody that this was taped on Friday morning, April 4th, 2025.
There you go. Yep. Frayne, how about you?
Oh, just to reiterate, Dave, that this is a very, as people are saying, very fluid condition and changing rapidly. So, this by this afternoon, it could all be shifted again. So just be careful and listen and pay attention.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. Again, my colleagues Frayne Olson and David Ripplinger, both agricultural economists from North Dakota State University. Myself, Dan O'Brien, an extension agricultural economist with Kansas State. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and hope to come back to you in another month to assess what's transpired in that time. And no doubt it'll be quite a bit. Take care. Talk to you later.